She smelled the pasta before the dirty dishwater hit her. The smell had come first: garlic butter, something slow and rich drifting through the open service door of Rosewood Dining and finding her on the pavement outside with 500 Nigerian nairas in her purse and 2 daughters who had not eaten since morning and a baby 8 months along pressing against her ribs like a reminder that the world was not yet ready, but she was coming anyway. The smell had been the promise. The bucket was the answer. Desmond Obi was stepping out of his car on the other side of those same glass doors when it happened. He owned the restaurant. He had not visited it in months. He had not planned to stop today. He did not know yet that the next 5 minutes were going to reach back 36 years and pull something out of him he had spent his entire adult life trying to leave behind. Her name was Tessie, and 3 weeks ago she had been a woman with a home. Not a perfect home. Not a peaceful one, not in the way peace requires 2 people moving in the same direction at the same time. But it had been hers, a 2-bedroom flat in Surrey, a kitchen with a working stove, a sitting room where Chisholm and Arya spread their drawings across the floor on Sunday mornings while she made akara, and the smell of it filled every corner and made the whole place feel briefly like enough. The scan had been on a Wednesday. She had gone alone because Paul had a meeting he said he could not move, and she had lain on the clinic table and watched the screen and felt the specific joy of seeing a life become visible that was already completely real to her. The technician had smiled when she told her. Tessie had smiled back. She had called Paul from the clinic car park with a phone warm in her hand and the afternoon sun on her face and something open and unguarded in her chest that she had not had the foresight to protect. Paul had not said anything for a long time. Then he had said, "Are you sure?" She had said yes. She was sure. He had said he would see her at home. She had understood from the specific flatness of those 5 words that something had shifted beneath them. She had simply not understood yet how far it had already shifted or how fast it was going to move. By Friday, the flat was missing things she had not noticed were his until they were gone. The television. The standing fan. The microwave. The good pots. The documents from the top of the wardrobe, her teaching credentials, the children's birth certificates, their marriage papers, because Paul, it turned out, had been thorough in a way that suggested he had been preparing for this longer than Wednesday. By Monday, he was gone entirely. She had stood in the doorway of the stripped flat with the girls behind her and made her face perform a calm she did not feel because Chisholm was 6 and already too perceptive and Arya was 4 and asked questions that landed heavier than she knew, and they were both watching her and she was not going to let them see what the room was doing to her chest. Arya had walked past her into the sitting room and turned in a slow circle, for years old, trying to make sense of the absences. "Daddy moved the TV," she said. "Yes," Tessie said. "Where did he move it?" "I don't know yet." She found out that evening from Paul's mother, who called with the specific discomfort of a woman delivering a message she disagreed with but had been asked to carry. Paul had moved to a flat in Lekki. There was a woman named Blessing already living there. She was expecting a child whose gender had not yet been confirmed, though Paul's mother's careful silence on that point told Tessie everything she needed to know about what Paul was hoping for. This was the thing that had broken him loose from her in the end. Not a failure of love, not another woman, not the accumulation of ordinary incompatibilities that end most marriages quietly over years. It was a gender. 3 times he had hoped for a son, and 3 times a scan had told him otherwise, and the 3rd time had been the last time he was willing to absorb the answer. He had asked her to quit teaching when Arya was born. A man of his standing, he had said, did not need his wife to work. She had believed him the way you believe someone you have decided to trust, not naively, but completely, which is its own kind of vulnerability. She had handed in her notice and built her days around the flat and the girls and the cooking and the life Paul said he wanted. She had done this for 2 years. She had been good at it. And then one Wednesday scan had undone all of it, and she was standing in a half-empty flat with 2 daughters and a third on the way and 500 Nigerian nairas in her purse and no salary and no savings that were entirely hers and a church that helped when it could and a family that helped when they had something to give. She had managed the church's 3,000 Nigerian nairas across the week with the precision of someone for whom the margin between eating and not eating was exactly as thin as the arithmetic said it was. By Thursday afternoon, the arithmetic had produced 500 Nigerian nairas and no further options. She had taken the girls to the park because the park was free and because the flat with its bare corners and its smell of somebody's departure was worse than the heat outside. She had packed 1 bottle of water and 2 chin-chin in a plastic bag and held their hands across the 2 crossings and sat on the bench by the fountain and watched them play and felt for an hour something that was almost ordinary. Then the hour had ended and hunger had made itself impossible to ignore, and they were walking home past Rosewood Dining when the smell of pasta found her and stopped her feet on the pavement, and she had looked at the restaurant and done the arithmetic one more time and arrived at the same answer and walked toward the door anyway because the smell was a promise and she was 8 months pregnant and her daughters had not eaten since morning and some promises are worth walking toward even when you know better. She tightened her hand around Aria's. She looked down at Chisholm. "Come," she said. "Let's go and ask." The hostess at the front desk assembled her opinion before Tessie finished walking through the door. Tessie watched it happen. The quick downward glance, the sandals worn thin at the heel, the dress clean but old, the stomach, the girls, the entire picture completed and evaluated before a single word passed between them. "I would like to speak with whoever is in charge," Tessie said. "Please." The hostess picked up the phone and said something too quiet to hear. The woman who came out of the kitchen walked the way certain people walk when they have decided, some years ago, that every room they enter should register their arrival before they speak. Blazer. Heels on tile. A face arranged into the expression of someone whose time is valuable and is about to be wasted. Her name was Ronk. She was 38 years old and had managed Rosewood Dining for 6 of them, running it with a precision that the owner had never needed to question, which meant the owner had also never needed to look closely at how the precision was maintained or what it cost the people on the receiving end of it. She had been married for 15 years to a man named Segan who was the kind of patient that is not performance or strategy but character, a fundamental quality that had carried them through 14 years of trying and failing and hoping and the slow narrowing of hope into something that no longer had a name they were willing to say out loud. 14 years of clinics and waiting rooms and treatments that worked briefly and then didn't. And prayer she had eventually stopped being able to say because prayer required a kind of openness she could no longer maintain without it costing her more than she had to spend. They had stopped trying 2 years ago. Ronk had not sat with what stopping meant because sitting with it required stillness, and stillness was not something she could afford. She kept the restaurant moving instead. She kept herself moving. She kept her hands full and her standards high and the distance between herself and the things she could not have carefully managed by staying in motion. What gathered in the space where sitting with it should have happened was nothing. It was something that had organized itself, quietly and without her full awareness, into a conviction that women who walked into restaurants with hungry children and unborn babies and empty purses were committing a category of offense she felt in her body before she could name it in her mind. She had never examined this conviction closely enough to understand where it came from, because examining it would have required the stillness she was not willing to enter. She looked at Tessie. She looked at the girls. She looked at the stomach. "What do you want?" she said. Not a question. "Good afternoon, Ma." Tessie held her voice level. "I'm sorry to come in without a reservation. My girls haven't eaten since this morning. I have 500 Nigerian nairas. I know it isn't enough for a full plate, but I thought maybe there was something from the kitchen leftovers, anything you were going to put away." 500 Nigerian nairas, Ronk said. "Yes, Ma." Ronk looked at the girls again. Aria was still carrying the leaf she had picked up at the park fountain, a large green thing she had been transporting carefully for 2 hours because she had decided it was important. Chisholm was looking at the floor with the eyes of a child who has learned to make herself small in rooms where she is not sure she belongs. Something moved through Ronk that was not kindness and not entirely cruelty. It was older and less examined than either. It was the wound responding to being touched without warning, the way wounds respond when they have spent enough time untended, not with pain which would have been honest, but with rage which was faster and required less exposure. "Come with me," she said. Tessie followed her toward the kitchen because the word sounded, for a moment, like the beginning of yes. The bucket was gray plastic beside the kitchen door. Inside it was the end of the morning's cleaning, gray water, food residue, the smell of a working kitchen's floor distilled into liquid. Ronk picked it up. She turned around. She looked at Tessie standing in the corridor with her daughters behind her, and her hands folded and her face still carrying the shape of hope that the word come had placed there. She poured it. The water hit Tessie across the front of her dress, and it was cold, and it smelled like the floor, and it happened fast enough that the sound of the pour and the clatter of the bucket and Chisholm's sharp breath all arrived simultaneously with the understanding of what had just been done. Aria's leaf fell. Chisholm took her mother's hand with both of hers and held it with the grip of a child who does not know what to do but understands that holding on is the right instinct when the world suddenly makes no sense. Tessie stood in the spreading wet on the corridor tiles. Her hand moved to her stomach. Not a performance. The pure instinct of a woman whose body understood, before her mind caught up, that this was not only about her. She did not cry. She had made a private decision sometime in the last 3 weeks, in a half-empty flat with the girls asleep and the silence pressing in from all sides, that her tears were hers and she would not spend them in rooms that had not earned them. She held still. The restaurant had gone the way restaurants go when something happens that nobody planned for, completely and immediately silent. The espresso machine. The cutlery. Every conversation at every white tablecloth table. All of it stopped, the way sound stops when the thing that has just happened is the kind of thing a room needs a moment to absorb before it knows what to do next. Ronk set the bucket down. She straightened. She looked at Tessie with the expression of someone who has resolved something. Next time, she said, her voice carrying easily across the silence, don't walk into places that aren't built for people like you. You want someone to help you feed your children, go and find the people whose job that is. This is not that place. She turned back toward the kitchen. The door opened behind her. Desmond Obie had stepped out of the Mercedes, straightened his jacket, and looked through the restaurant's glass front before going in, not looking for anything specific, just the habitual scan of a man who had spent 30 years walking into rooms and assessing them before entering. Not the bucket. He had missed that. He saw only what remained after, a woman standing in wet clothes with her hand pressed to her stomach and 2 small girls beside her and the whole restaurant frozen around her and not one person in it moving. He was through the door before he decided to go through it. This was how he understood later, that what happened in him was not a decision. Decisions have a moment between the seeing and the doing, a pause where the mind assesses and weighs and concludes. What happened in him when his eyes found Tessie in that corridor had no such pause. It went directly from eye to body, the way certain things bypass the mind entirely because they are recognized somewhere older and deeper than the mind, somewhere that does not need to think before it moves. He was 10 years old. His mother's name was Ngozi. She was 29, small in the way of women whose bodies have reorganized themselves around years of physical work, with hands that were dry from chemicals and a posture that was always slightly forward-leaning, permanently prepared for whatever came next. She worked a double shift at a printing press in Yaba 5 days a week and spent her Saturdays doing other people's laundry. She was the kind of woman who set aside money the way other people breathe, automatically, without drama, because stopping was not an option. Desmond had been sick that year. His chest. The kind of cough that lived deep and woke him at night and could not be ignored by either of them. The doctor had given them the name of a medication, and Ngozi had saved for it across 6 weeks, a small amount from each shift, kept in a tin in the kitchen that Desmond knew not to touch. On the Saturday she had enough. She had taken him with her to the chemist on Ojulegba Road. He had been carrying a small paper bag with 2 chin-chin inside because she had bought them from the woman outside as a small thing, a reward for being patient while she handled the errand. She had walked to the counter. She had stated the medication by name. She had placed the money down. The man behind the counter had looked at her the way Ronk had looked at Tessie, the whole picture, assembled and evaluated before she finished speaking. The worn blouse. The dry hands. The boy with the paper bag. He had looked, and he had decided, and what he decided to do was laugh. He had repeated her pronunciation back to her in a mocking voice and called the other man from the back to come and listen, and the other man had laughed too, and 2 customers near the door had looked, and one had looked away, and one had not. Ngozi had stood at the counter and not moved. She had not cried. She had not raised her voice. She had waited with the specific stillness of a woman who has decided that her tears are hers and this room has not earned them, and when the laughter finished she had repeated her request quietly, and the man had filled it, and she had taken the medication and taken her son's hand and walked out into the afternoon without looking back. Desmond had walked beside her holding the paper bag. He had been 10 years old. He had no power to intervene and no language yet for what he had witnessed, and so he had simply stood there holding the bag and watching his mother's back and feeling something open in his chest that was not the cough. Something that had no name at 10 but that he had spent the next 36 years slowly, imperfectly understanding. He had thought about that paper bag in the years when he had nothing and in the years when he had everything. He had thought about it in the back of cars that insulated him from the world while the city moved past the tinted windows. He had thought about it in boardrooms and on private planes and in the specific silence of very large offices at night when the work was done, and the building was empty, and he was alone with whatever version of himself the day had left behind. He had thought about standing still. He was not standing still today. He crossed the restaurant floor without hurrying and without stopping. The room watched him the way rooms watch people who move with the specific intention of someone who has already decided what happens next. He reached the corridor entrance, and he stopped beside Tessie, and he looked at her. She looked back at him with the eyes of a woman who has been surprised enough times in 3 weeks that she now approaches every new development as a calculation to be run before a response is given. She was reading him, the suit, the posture, the way the staff had already begun to shift in their positions the moment he entered the room, and she was deciding. He did not speak to her first. He turned to the nearest waiter, who had been standing frozen by the service station since the bucket, and said quietly, "Warm towels. Now." The waiter moved immediately, which told Tessie something she filed away. Then Desmond turned to Ronk, who had stopped walking when she heard the door and was now standing at the kitchen entrance looking at him with the beginning of a frown, the expression of a person who has encountered an obstacle they have not yet categorized. "Mr. Obi," she said, and her voice had already lost half its authority in the 2 seconds it took her to recognize him. "I didn't know you were. I wasn't expecting." "I know you weren't," Desmond said. He said it without heat. Simply. The way you state a fact that requires no emphasis because the emphasis is already built into the situation. He looked at the bucket still sitting beside the kitchen door. He looked at the wet on the corridor tiles. He looked at Tessie's dress. "She came in and asked for help," he said. "You poured a bucket of dirty water on a pregnant woman in front of her children." Ronk opened her mouth. "In my restaurant," he said. The 2 words landed in the silence the way 2 words can land when they carry the full weight of what they mean. Ronk closed her mouth. The color moved in her face in a way she could not control. "Mr. Obi," she was begging. She had no business coming in here, She smelled food, and she walked in and asked politely for help. He looked at her steadily. "I know because the hostess called it in and I was already on my way through the door. I heard how she asked." He paused. "I also saw what you did." Ronk's mouth opened again. He did not give her the space to use it. "Your contract will be processed by HR this afternoon," he said. "Collect your personal things from the office before 5. He turned back to Tessie before Ronk could respond. He looked at the towel the waiter had brought and held it out toward her, not pressing it into her hands, just offering it, leaving the distance between them for her to decide. She took it. She pressed it to the front of her dress. Her hands were steady, which he could see had cost her something, and he did not comment on it. "Please sit down," he said. "All 3 of you. Wherever you like." Tessie looked at him. The calculation was still running. He could see it. He waited. "Thank you," she said. It came out smaller than she intended. "Sit down first," he said. "Then we'll see." Ronk left through the back before the food arrived. She did not slam anything. She did not make a scene. She gathered her bag from the office, and she walked through the kitchen and out through the delivery entrance into the afternoon heat, and she stood on the pavement behind the restaurant for a long time before she called Segan. She did not tell him everything that day. She told him she had lost her job. He asked what happened. She said she had made a decision she could not defend and that she would explain it properly when she could find the right words. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he was coming to get her, and she said okay, and she stood on the pavement and waited. She would find the words eventually. It would take longer than she expected, and the finding of them would require a kind of sitting still she had been avoiding for 2 years, and the sitting still would cost her more than she had anticipated. But the words were there, underneath everything. They had always been there, waiting for her to stop moving long enough to hear them. Segan almost left. She found this out months later, when enough had shifted between them that he could tell her. He had packed a bag one evening and sat on the edge of the bed with it beside him and spent an hour alone with his thoughts before unpacking it. He told her this not as a threat and not as a weapon but because she had asked him to be honest with her about that period, and he was honoring the request. She had sat with that information the way she was learning, slowly, to sit with things. She had understood for the first time what it felt like to be on the edge of losing the thing you had organized your entire life around. She had understood it from the inside. She was not sure she could have understood it any other way. She went and found a therapist. A woman who specialized in grief, which turned out to be what it was underneath everything. Grief that had been denied and rerouted and had come out sideways for years in ways Ronk had never recognized as grief because it had not looked like sadness. It had looked like standards. It had looked like control. It had looked like a restaurant that ran perfectly and a manager who did not tolerate disorder in any form, including the disorder of a pregnant woman with 500 Nigerian nairas and hungry daughters and the audacity to walk through a door and ask, She thought about the bucket more than she thought about anything else from that period. She thought about Arya's leaf falling into the gray water and lying there. She thought about Chisholm's hands gripping her mother and the way Tessie had stood still and not given the room her tears. She never called Tessie. She was not sure she had earned the right to make that call. But she thought about her, and the thinking was its own kind of work, and the work was not finished, but it was happening, which was more than she could say for the 2 years before the bucket. Some lessons do not arrive as punishment. They arrive as mirrors held up at angles you were not expecting, showing you the distance between who you are and who you had decided not to examine. At the table, Desmond did not sit with Tessie uninvited. He stood at a distance until she looked up, and when she did, he asked. She nodded. He sat. He did not fill the silence immediately because he had learned, over many years of being in rooms where people needed things from him, that silence was not always a problem requiring a solution. Sometimes it was the most honest response available. Arya had eaten most of her pasta. She looked at him over the rim of her glass with the open, assessing eyes of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to be strategic about her attention. "Are you the owner of the food?" she said. "Something like that," Desmond said. She considered this. "It's good food," she said, with the authority of someone who expected her opinion to be taken seriously. "I'll tell the chef," he said. She went back to her pasta. Chisholm was watching him from beside her mother with the careful eyes of a 6-year-old who has spent 3 weeks learning to read rooms quickly. She did not speak. She was still deciding. Tessie was doing what she had been doing since the corridor, running the calculation, measuring the distance between what this man appeared to be and what he was likely to want. "Why?" she said. Just the one word, which contained several. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the restaurant, the afternoon traffic had thickened. Through the window the street moved with the ordinary business of a city that had kept going while something happened inside this building. "When I was 10 years old," he said, "my mother walked into a chemist in Ojulegba to buy medication for my chest. She had saved for 6 weeks to afford it. The man behind the counter decided she was worth less than the counter she was standing at. He mocked her in front of everyone in the shop." He paused. Nobody moved. "I was standing next to her holding a bag of chin-chin, and I was 10 years old, and I couldn't move either." He looked at the table. "I have been standing in that chemist every day since," he said. "Today I was not 10 years old, and I was not standing still. That is the whole reason." Tessie said nothing for a long moment. She looked at Chisholm, who had fallen asleep against her mother's arm, the tension of the afternoon releasing the way it releases in children when they decide the danger has passed. She looked at Arya, who had abandoned the pasta in favor of studying the restaurant's ceiling with focused interest. She said, "What happens now?" He reached into his jacket and placed a card on the table. "When you are ready, not now, after the baby, when you are ready, call that number. I have 3 foundation schools that need qualified teachers. You taught primary school. I have looked at what that requires, and you are qualified." He looked at her steadily. "I am not offering you charity. I am offering you a door. What you do on the other side of it is entirely yours." She looked at the card. She did not pick it up immediately. She sat with it on the table between them the way she sat with everything now, carefully, checking it from all angles before committing to it. Then she picked it up. She put it in her purse. She did not say thank you, and he did not expect her to. She met his eyes and nodded once, the way people nod when words would cost more than they have available, and he understood completely. He stood. He pushed in his chair. "The meal is covered," he said. "Take as long as you need." He walked out into the afternoon and got into the back of the Mercedes and sat for a long time before telling his driver to go. He sat with his hands open on his knees and thought about a paper bag and a chemist and a woman with dry hands who had stood at a counter and not given the room her tears. He thought about what it had taken for her to do that. He thought about what it had taken for Tessie to do the same thing today. He thought about the leaf on the corridor floor, lying in the gray water, and the 4-year-old who had dropped it. He told his driver to go. The baby came on a Sunday. A girl, as the scan had promised and Paul had refused. Tessie named her Olusian, "God has answered me," and held her in the hospital ward while Chisholm and Arya pressed in on either side of the bed, both trying to touch the baby's hand at the same time, both whispering things Tessie could not fully hear but did not need to hear to understand. Arya told the baby her name was too long and she was going to call her something shorter. Chisholm said that was rude. Arya said it was practical. Tessie lay against the pillow and listened to her daughters argue about a name and felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled since the Wednesday of the scan. She called the number on the card when Olusian was 4 months old. The woman who answered put her through without asking her to explain who she was, which told her something. She had prepared an explanation. She did not need it. Desmond remembered. He asked about the baby before he asked about anything else. She started teaching the following September. 3rd grade. A classroom with windows that let the morning light in properly, and a whiteboard that worked, and children who needed exactly what she had spent 2 years setting aside while she maintained a flat that belonged to a life that no longer existed. She was not entry-level. She went in at the level her qualifications earned because Desmond had looked at her credentials before she started and said simply, "You earned these. We pay accordingly." She had not known what to do with that sentence, and so she had said thank you, and he had said just teach well, and she had done exactly that. The girls grew up knowing the restaurant story the way children grow up with the stories that explain their family to them. Half memory, half myth, the details shifting depending on who was telling it and what they needed it to mean at that particular moment of their lives. Aria's version always began with the leaf. She remembered the leaf most clearly, the specific green of it, the weight of it in her 4-year-old hand, the way it fell when the water came. She had been sad about the leaf. She had not fully understood the other thing, but she had understood the leaf, and the leaf had been hers, and it had fallen into water that should not have been there, and somehow the injustice of that had lodged in her 4-year-old chest in a way that informed who she became more than she could ever fully trace. Chisholm's version was more precise. She remembered the order of things, the smell first, then the door, then Ronk's face, then the corridor, then the water, then the man coming through the front door. She had the sequence because she had been the one holding her mother's hand, which meant she had been paying attention to everything with the specific focus of a child who understands that she is the oldest and that the oldest one pays attention so the younger one doesn't have to. Olusian's version was the most interesting because she had not been there. She had assembled her version entirely from her sister's accounts and her mother's occasional careful tellings, which meant it was the least accurate and the most honest. A story about what the moment had meant rather than what it had been. About a smell and a promise and a bucket and a man who had walked through a door because he was no longer 10 years old and was not going to stand still. Paul came back when Chisholm was finishing secondary school. He arrived on a Saturday with the look of a man who has spent years in an argument with himself and has finally reached a verdict he does not like. He said he was sorry. He said he had been wrong. He said he had not understood what he was throwing away until he had spent enough time outside it to see its shape. The girls stood in the sitting room and looked at him. Chisholm spoke first because she always spoke first, because she had been the one paying attention since the corridor and she had not stopped. "We forgave you a long time ago," she said. "Mama said forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the person asking. So we put it down. We put it down, and we kept going. That doesn't mean you can come back and pick up where you left off. You made your decision. We made ours." He looked at Aria. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I don't know you well enough to be angry at you. That's not a gift. That's just what happened." He looked at Olusian, the daughter whose gender had sent him out the door, who was 17 now and looking at him with the evaluating eyes she had arrived with in the delivery ward, the same eyes that had assessed the restaurant ceiling as a 4-month-old and had not stopped assessing everything since. She said, "I used to wonder what I would say to you if you came. I don't have anything to say. I just wanted you to know that I'm fine. We're all fine. You can go." He left the way people leave when the understanding has arrived too late to change anything. Quietly, with the door closing behind him rather than slamming, which was its own kind of answer about who he had eventually become. Tessie stood at the kitchen window and listened to the door close and felt, to her own quiet surprise, almost nothing. Not triumph, not grief, not the remnant anger she had expected to find still waiting for her after all these years. Just the specific piece of a chapter that had ended at the page where it was supposed to end. She became head of curriculum for the Foundation School Network at 41. She found out on a Tuesday in a meeting she had believed was routine, and she drove home afterward and sat in the car outside the house for several minutes before going inside, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she wanted to hold the feeling privately before it became a story she shared. She had learned to do this. To take the private moment before the public one. The moment that belonged entirely to her before it became part of everything else. She sat in the car and thought about a pavement and a smell of pasta and a decision to walk through a door with 500 Nigerian nairas and 2 hungry daughters and 8 months of a daughter not yet met and whatever had remained of her dignity after 3 weeks in a half-empty flat. She thought about grey water on corridor tiles. She thought about a card placed on a table and the moment she had picked it up and put it in her purse without saying thank you because some things arrive when you have nothing left for words. She thought about Oluseun, who was now 7 and moved through the world with the evaluating eyes she had been born with, already asking questions about everything, including questions about the restaurant, about the leaf, about the man who had walked through the door. Why did he help? Oluseun had asked once. She was 5. She had been asking for 2 years, and each time the answer had been slightly different because Tessie was still finding the full shape of it. Because someone didn't help his mother once, Tessie had said. And he never forgot what that felt like. Oluseun had thought about this. So he helped you because of his mother? He helped me because of who he decided to be, Tessie said. His mother just showed him what it cost when nobody did. Oluseun had accepted this in the way she accepted things, completely, and then immediately moved to the next question. Tessie sat in the car outside her house and thought about that conversation, and then she went inside where Arya had started cooking and Chisholm had set the table, and Oluseun was sitting on the kitchen counter eating chin-chin from a bowl she had opened without permission, talking to it about something only she understood, and Tessie stood in the doorway of her kitchen and let the noise of all 3 of them come toward her like something she had earned. Desmond told his mother about the restaurant on a Sunday visit to Enugu, sitting on the veranda of the house he had built for her when he finally had enough money to build it, drinking the tea she made that he had never been able to replicate in any kitchen in any of his houses. Ngozi was 70 years old. She was still small and still forward-leaning, and her hands were still dry even though she had not worked a factory floor in 20 years, because some things the body holds long after the mind has moved on. He told her the whole of it. The corridor. The wet dress. The girls. The leaf. The way his body had moved through the door before he decided to go through it. She listened without interrupting, the way she had always listened, which was completely. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You were going to do that eventually. I knew it when you were 10 years old standing in that chemist. You looked at that man behind the counter, and you didn't look away. You just looked at him like you were memorizing something." "I was," Desmond said. "What were you memorizing?" He thought about this. The veranda. The trees. The afternoon coming in through the leaves. What it looked like, he said. So I would know it when I saw it again. So I would know which way to move. Ngozi held her tea with both hands and looked at the garden. "You moved correctly," she said. They sat in the quiet of the veranda and drank their tea, and the afternoon moved through the trees the way afternoon moves in Enugu, slowly, with the specific unhurried quality of a place that has not been convinced by the world's argument for speed. Desmond thought about a paper bag. He thought about a boy standing in a chemist holding 2 chin-chin. He thought about a woman's back and the way she had held herself upright when someone was trying to make her feel small, and the way she had walked out afterward without looking back at the man who had tried. He thought about the distance between that boy and the man sitting on this veranda. He thought about Tessie standing in the wet in the corridor and not giving the room her tears. He thought about all the rooms where people were standing in wet right now, holding still, waiting for someone to come through the door. He thought about all the doors. There is a woman somewhere right now who smelled the pasta before the dirty water hit her. Who walked toward a promise because her daughters were hungry and her body was full and 500 Nigerian nairas was what she had and she was going to use it to try. Who stood in the wet afterward and did not cry because her tears were hers and the room had not earned them. She is not waiting to be saved. She is calculating. She is measuring the distance between where she is and where her children need to be. She is holding still because holding still is sometimes the bravest available option when everything in you wants to collapse. The question this story leaves me with, and I want to leave it with you too, is not about Desmond. Desmond moved. That part is settled. The question is about the room. There were people at every table in Rosewood dining that afternoon. People who heard the bucket. People who saw the wet. People who watched a pregnant woman stand in a dirty dishwater with her daughters beside her and did not move. What were they holding? What would you have done? Tell me in the comments.